For our first intermission this afternoon, Opera News on the Air, our guest is Father Owen Lee, who will discuss Puccini and Turandot, illustrating his remarks with excerpts from the opera played on the Yamaha. Father Lee.
Thank you, Peter Allen. In the largely male mythology that has developed in the Western world over the past 3 millennia, the voracious virago, the destructive female that lures males to their deaths, is an archetypal figure. She is familiar from the sirens in Homer's Odyssey, to rose-bedded Pyrrha in the Odes of Horace, to the Belle Dame sans merci of John Keats, to the dream figures of the Freudians and Jungians of our century, who say that all of us males are afraid of her, deep in our psyches, where she lives. It is our mandate, they say, to win her, if we are ever to relate maturely to the world she commands, our inner world. In the art and the myths of intuitive males, she keeps surfacing and resurfacing, often with the mythic number 3, now as the mysterious Sphinx, waylaying travelers with her threefold riddle of what it is to be a man, now as the athletic Atalanta, challenging her suitors to race with her at the risk of death, and undone finally by 3 golden apples, now as the prudent Portia in The Merchant of Venice, forbidding her would-be wooers from ever marrying if they cannot solve the riddle of her 3, note the word, caskets. But it is in that most mythic of art forms, opera, that this figure really comes into her own, as Turandot, Puccini's suitor-slaughtering princess, with her 3 mystifying riddles. Turandot, I'll sound the final T, for Puccini found his version of the myth in a fairy tale play by Carlo Gozzi with a double T and an E at the end of its title, Turandotte. Puccini begins his opera with a 4-note phrase which I always think of as an acknowledgement of that source, Turandotte. And again, Turandotte. And then immediately the curtain sweeps upward, and we see on the walls of old Peking the severed heads of Turandot's former suitors impaled on spikes. And the orchestra slashes out a head-chopping chord over and over. That not inappropriately named critic, Spike Hughes, says that chord is as much Puccini's Turandot chord as the famous first chord in Tristan is Wagner's. Here is Puccini's chord. Superimposing C-sharp minor on D minor, Puccini's bitonal chord seems instantly to evoke a special world, the psychic world in which the story takes place. This will not be the charming fairy tale Peking of Gozzi's original play, nor will this be what we have always expected of Puccini in the past, verismo, his realistic stage illustration of some picturesque locale in Paris or Rome or California. This time, like Wagner or like those Italians who invented opera 3 centuries before, Puccini will be dramatizing myth. He will show us nothing less, in fact, than the archetypal myth of the maturing male, the myth of what Joseph Campbell called the hero with 1,000 faces. Here is Puccini's theme for the male's maturing. Appropriately, it is announced first by a distant chorus of innocent boys. That theme reappears in ever more mature manifestations when the young Prince Calaf's detestation of Turandot turns to desire for her, and when he accepts the challenge of her and sounds the signaling gong, and triumphantly when he answers her 3 riddles rightly. Essential to the myth of the maturing male is the father figure. Mythically, it is the old Emperor Altum who is the father figure towards whom our hero travels, and the emperor who encourages the hero to become a son to him gets a theme that is related in its pentatonic outlines to the theme of the maturing male. But of course, young Calaf has a flesh and blood father too, old Timur. Puccini introduces him on the 2nd page of the score. Also essential to the hero myth, as our mythologists and psychologists tell us, are dual anima, that is to say, female figures. The hero must encounter the potentially destructive woman, Turandot herself, and the potentially creative woman, whom Puccini has, perhaps instinctively, added to Carlo Gozzi's original story. She is little Liu. Even in myth, Puccini could not forego the one character he knew would never fail him, the suffering heroine. Now, in common with many commentators on opera, I have a problem with Puccini, and at this point in our considerations, I should in honesty attempt to define it, admitting all the while that I could, of course, be quite wrong. When he was working on Tosca, Puccini sent to one of his friends some butterfly specimens pinned to a board with the following note. These butterflies may serve to give you some idea of the transient nature of poor human lives. As corpses, let them remind you that when evening comes, we all must die. While I am racking my brain in the stillness of the night to bring my Roman heroine to life, I act as executioner to these poor, frail creatures. My neuronic instinct surfaces and fulfills itself. More than one listener has sensed something neuronic, something of the Roman Emperor Nero, or at least something of the executioner in Puccini. It was Puccini who added to Manon Lescaut the scene in which the women destined for deportation are marched in chains before the mob at Le Havre. It was Puccini who brought the firing squad on the stage in Tosca and the lynching party in Fanciulla. They are not there in the plays on which his operas are based. It was Puccini who introduced the executioner grinding his axe in Turandot, and it was Puccini who invented the slave Liu and had her tortured before our eyes. It is often said of Puccini that he could not compose unless competing with a rival, challenging Massenet with another Manon, beating Leoncavallo to the draw with another Bohème, tricking Franchetti out of the rights to Tosca. But the major stimulus to composing, Puccini himself tells us what that was in the quote about the butterflies, and in another, yet more revealing remark made while working on Turandot. I have the great weakness, he said, of being able to compose only when my public executioners come on the scene. His creative powers quickened when he had before him a specimen of human suffering. In his 7 major works, 7 beautiful butterflies, Manon, Mimi, Tosca, Cho-Cho-san, Minnie, Suor Angelica, and Liu, are pinned quivering beneath the examiner's glass. 6 of them die. Puccini's confessions are made with humor and humility, but they ought not to be dismissed as light remarks. They are serious, and they partially explain why this man of prodigious musical and dramatic gifts has not been accepted by critics and musicologists as an artist of the first rank. He works to an overwhelming degree on a single level and with a single interest, the sentimental depiction of mental and physical suffering in his heroines. You may say, well, the opera stage has always trafficked in suffering heroines. But only Puccini, of the perennially performed composers, seems interested more in the suffering than in the heroine. Mozart's Constanze, threatened with tortures, sings her defiance in elaborate, proudly beautiful roulades, supported, I like to think, defended by 4 solo instruments in concertante. Verdi's suffering Violetta dies on a triumphant high B-flat, and Wagner's doomed Sieglinde exits with the radiant theme that will eventually make sense of the whole ring 2 dramas later. The Ange Pur of Gounod's Marguerite storms heaven, and Poulenc's Carmelites go to the scaffold singing a death-braving Salve Regina. The sufferings of all of them point beyond the pathos of their lives. By comparison, or even considered in themselves, Puccini's heroines suffer to satisfy his, and presumably our, sense of pity. Puccini considered many more subjects than he ever realized on stage, and in these unrealized projects the pattern continues. Marie Antoinette going to the guillotine, Nancy clubbed to death by Bill Sykes, Trilby hypnotized by Svengali, Esmeralda carried off by the hunchback of Notre Dame, Ouida's lovesick Bébé drowning herself after walking from Brabant to Paris and back in the snow in her wooden shoes, Conchita, a subject eventually used on the screen by Louis Buñuel, awakened to desire by a brutal beating. In Carousel, Richard Rogers had Liliam's wife ask what was the use of wondering about the pain he caused her. And in Pelléas, Debussy had Mélisande dragged by her long hair across the stage, but each composer, with his own kind of musical understatement, pointed to meanings beyond the pathetic situations. Somehow, one knows what Puccini, also interested in those subjects, would have done had he got the rights to the original plays. The rubati, the ostinati, the tremoli, the diminished sevenths, the thick unison tutis thundering from the orchestra, all of these would have compelled us to tears, even as they compelled us to watch. Try as he would, Puccini could not compose without his suffering heroine. Even when, in Turandot, he turned his attention instead to a maturing hero, and he was plagued with doubt and despair as his myth came to realization. This infamous opera, Turandot, he said, it terrifies me, and I shall not finish it. At one point he predicted that, at the first performance, someone would have to come forward and say, at this point, the master died. And that is exactly what did happen at the premiere. Puccini could not write past the death of the suffering Liu. Why was Turandot so difficult for its creator? Not, I think, because it was on a vast scale with a chorus and an orchestra such as he had never attempted before. That was no problem for Puccini. The treatment of both chorus and orchestra in this opera is masterful. I think the problem was that Puccini wanted, with this final opera, to deal with something not just pathetic, but with something profound, with myth. Myths are made to tell us what transpires in the soul, and Turandot may be said to reveal its creator's soul nakedly. Little Liu is, by order of Turandot, seized and bound, and her arms are twisted till she almost dies, but she will not betray her beloved. Turandot has never seen such faithfulness. What, she asks, has given you such courage? Love, says Liu. Love, Turandot repeats as if she had never heard the word. It is the most important word in the opera. Liu considers her sacrifice necessary if Turandot is ever to know what love means. You will come to love him as I do, she says. I will close my eyes so that he will win you. And instantly Liu seizes a dagger from one of her tormentors and sinks it into her heart. But Turandot is not moved. She merely lashes with a whip the soldier whose weapon Liu had seized. Prince Kalof at least is moved, but he does not learn from what is supposed to be a sacrificial death and, as every commentator on the opera agrees, is not. Here is where biographers hurry in to tell us, and we cannot not listen, that at their country home in Torre del Lago, Puccini and his wife Elvira had a servant named Doria Manfredi. Puccini was notorious for his philandering, and Doria was beautiful, and Elvira was sure that the two were guilty of what she called immoral conduct. Both denied the charge. Elvira, not satisfied, broadcast the slander through the village and kept up her face-to-face insults until, after 4 months, Doria killed herself, quietly, swallowing 3 tablets of sublimate. The press treated it all sensationally. The village was outraged. An autopsy was held, and it was revealed that Doria had died a virgin. Her family sued. Puccini settled out of court, agonizing, unable to work for a year, insisting Elvira too deserves pity, coping, but only coping. The biographers all see these tensions in the situation Puccini introduced with little Liu into his Turandot. Puccini wrote no more of Turandot after the death of Liu. These are the last measures he wrote. A questo punto, said Toscanini, conducting the premiere, il maestro è morto. At this point, the master died, and Puccini and Toscanini, as predicted, laid down his baton at that point. The final scene was left unperformed that first night. Now Puccini had laid big plans for that final scene. Franco Alfano, who eventually wrote it, had 23 pages of sketches and 8 new musical themes left by Puccini to work with. But Puccini also knew that his treatment of the myth was at this point hopelessly confused. How could the prince let Liu be tortured? Why didn't he tell his name and stop the torture? Was the prince's passion for Turandot stronger than his compassion for Liu? And how could he let his blind father stumble off to exile without a word? What kind of barbarians are this prince and this princess? Who cares if they ever fall in love? In a stylized fable like Gozzi's original, we would not ask such questions. But in an emotionally charged drama like Puccini's, we do. 5 different endings were suggested to the composer, and none satisfied him. Eventually, he decided to do what the master of operatic myth, Wagner, had done. After contemplating 5 different endings for the Ring, Wagner let the orchestra, not the text, resolve the issue. Puccini, too, would turn to his orchestra. He told his librettist to stop trying to explain the story rationally. Love, he said, will take possession of everything in a great orchestral peroration. But despite 2 years' work on and 30 different attempts at that orchestral peroration, the music wouldn't come to him. It seems to me that Puccini's problem with Turandot was not the Doria affair, but that for the first time he was using myth for his material, and Puccini was, if not out of his depth, at least out of his element in myth. The raw materials are there, but the meanings simply won't come together, and the composer finds he cannot set his myth to music. He can't feel his way into the new, forbidding areas the myth opened up to him. I think the effort of it broke him. He was also, of course, affected by cancer of the larynx. He entered a clinic in Brussels where he was fitted with a collar of needles. Symbolically enough, 7 needles. I always think of the 7 butterflies. It was torment for him. I am on the cross like Jesus, he said. I seem to have bayonets in my throat. The terrible operation was successful in dealing with the cancer, but Puccini's heart gave way under the strain. Perhaps in this half hour I've said too little about that heart. In the half-century since it broke, millions of people, touched by the sufferings of the 7 butterflies and overwhelmed by the passionate music they sing, have been convinced that the heart that broke that day in Brussels was, despite all, a great heart. Who is to say that those millions of people are not right?
Thank you, Father Owen Lee.